We've got this 2-sermon series, Who is Jesus? You could maybe name every sermon, Who is Jesus? But the Gospel of Mark, which I really love, it's brief and Mark is to the point. In the first chapter here, we get 2 really good insights about who Jesus was. We preached about one last week, and if you didn't hear that one, you can hear it as a podcast on our website. Today we're going to look at verses 16 through 20, a second great insight about who Jesus was and how Jesus led in ministry. So beginning with verse 16. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As Jesus went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them as well. And they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men, and they followed Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago, I was in Israel. A number of you have been to Israel. You know that it is a remarkable country. For one thing, it's really beautiful. There are pastoral areas, especially in the northern part of the country. First time I went, I thought, well, no wonder I love the mountains of the Davis Mountains of West Texas, because they're not that dissimilar to parts of Israel. And so it's a beautiful country. They raise beautiful crops in the agricultural areas of Israel. And then Jerusalem is a remarkable city. If you've been there, you know that Jerusalem is actually 2 cities. On the one hand, there is the old city, parts of which are 2,500 years old, the old walls and walks. And then, of course, it is surrounded by New Jerusalem, which is a very, very modern city and a great city. There are skyscrapers, and there are people, you'll see people walking across the streets in Jerusalem that are dressed in the latest fashions. They look like models. I think a lot of them are. It's a very, very modern city. If you've been to London, as a contrast, London is a great city also, but London is an old city. And Jerusalem is a very new city surrounding a very old city. Of course, those of us who are Christians, when we go to Jerusalem or to Israel, we really go to experience the antiquity of the place for the most part. We kind of want to know what it was like, what it felt like to be Jesus or one of the disciples. And so we go through the old city and we walk the same path that Jesus walked on the way to the cross. We go to other ancient sites to try to experience what it would be like to have been alive 2,000 years ago with Jesus. And so I remember one day that we were there in Israel. It was a Saturday, and we were out on the Sea of Galilee. We weren't in an old sailboat or anything, but we were in kind of an old boat. It had a motor, but we were going to cross the Sea of Galilee, and it was kind of like trying to relive what it would be like to be with Jesus and the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Those stories that we hear about Jesus and the disciples in the boat on the Sea of Galilee. And we took out across the Sea of Galilee, and we got, I don't know, a quarter mile out there. And I looked around, and we were surrounded by water skiers. Water skiers. Here we are. I was trying to pretend like I was Peter, you know, in the boat with Jesus. And I look up, there's people water skiing all over the place. It was such a shock and a disappointment. And I remember turning to our guide who was Jewish, and I said, look, this is Saturday, right? He said, yeah, this is Saturday. I said, look, in the Jewish faith, Saturday is the Sabbath, right? He said, yeah, this is the Sabbath. I said, people are supposed to be in the synagogue, right? He said, look, you're an American. Most people in America are Christians, but most of them are secular. They're out fishing or water skiing on Sundays there, right? It's the same in Israel. This was such a disappointment to me. And yet, the more I thought about it, it was one of the great epiphany moments. Remember, we talked about this word epiphany, revealing a great truth. Suddenly in that moment, I understood something about the New Testament that I had never really understood. I understood the context in which Jesus did his ministry. Because, for instance, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you really read about two different, I'm simplifying somewhat, but you read about two different groups of people. On the one hand, you're reading about the religious people, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious people, the people who were in the synagogues all the time, the people that you'll see there in the old city of Jerusalem who walk around dressed in the same way they were 2,000 years ago. You can pick them out easily. They're religious people. So when you read the Gospels, there are the religious people, and then there's everybody else, all the ordinary people. And guess which ones were gathering around Jesus? It wasn't the religious people, it was the ordinary people. And so I don't mean to make light of this, but when Jesus came along the Sea of Galilee and he comes upon Peter and Andrew and they're out there getting ready, working on the boat or the nets or whatever, he says, "Come in and follow me." He was talking to secular people. When he came upon James and John helping their father Zebedee with the nets and the boat, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious people, they were back in church, in the synagogue. He was recruiting the people out there on the Sea of Galilee who were water skiing, the ones who were water skiing. And it was a remarkable insight, and it's always changed the way in which I read the New Testament. Jesus called very ordinary people to be his followers. Let me just put this in a modern context. In this church, if you're going to start a church, grow a church, we try to be pretty professional about it, don't we? I mean, if we were going to go out and look for a senior associate who can preach and who can do a dynamite Bible study on Monday mornings, has 90 or 100 people coming on Monday mornings for a Bible study, who has a gift of administration. We'd look around, we'd talk to the bishop, we'd look at the seminaries, we'd find a person out of the religious community, somebody like Denise Peckham. If we were going to find somebody to be in charge of congregational care, we'd find someone who has this wonderful personality, who's called and gifted, who's been to seminary, someone like Mike Flynn. By the way, this is just a little footnote. I'm not charging you for it at all. You heard maybe that Mike Flynn had been fired. Not this one. It's the other one. A lot of people were confused about that last week, believe it or not. I was watching, I told my wife, "Mike Flynn has been fired." She said, "I thought he was doing such a great job in congregational care." I didn't think of this for the last two services, so you all are special. You're getting this as extra. But I mean, we'd pick a Mike Flynn. If we wanted to find a great musician and organist, we'd go get in Bart Gent. Honestly, that's not how Jesus would do it. When you read the story in the Gospels, Jesus would start up here at the corner of Coit and Parker. He'd just start walking north. And maybe he'd stop in at the McDonald's across the street there and go back there and find somebody grilling hamburgers and say, "Look, come follow me." He would see something in that person. He said, "Come and follow me. I got work for you to do." And then he'd keep walking north. He might find somebody down in a manhole working for the city of Plano welding a pipe. He'd say, "Come on up out of there. I've got work for you to do." He'd be finding people that weren't in the religious community. That's the story we are told in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the story we get here, verses 16 through 20. Jesus was recruiting the water skiers and the fishermen. So when you look at this story, it tells us two really important things. One thing, it tells us something important about who we are, and it tells us something important about who God is. First of all, it tells us that we are people in whom God has planted special gifts, every single person. And that Jesus somehow had the capacity to see in an ordinary human being a remarkable, wonderful, special gift that can be used for building the kingdom of God. I worked my way through college. I worked for the United States Post Office on 3 different occasions. Twice while I was in college, and then I worked my way through seminary. I worked at the old downtown Dallas, the old, what we call the Terminal Annex, down there by Union Station. And it was terrible hours. You'd start at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and sometimes finish 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Terrible hours, especially if you were a seminary student and believed in going to class. I was one of those. They didn't get that, but at any rate. It was terrible hours, but it was really good money. And, you know, to be honest, most of the people that worked at the post office had high school educations. I would say there were, for the most part, not too many college graduates down there. And there was a guy that I met down there. I'd worked with him a little bit, and one day we were on break and we started talking. This guy had a high school diploma. That was it. He'd never been to college. And I don't know how we got onto the subject, but we started talking about philosophy. Turns out he had read Plato. He had read Aristotle, Spinoza. Go right down. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. He had read volumes more philosophy than I had. He should have been in a postgraduate program in philosophy. I will never forget him. Nobody ever told him. He was probably one of those kids that was so bright he was always bored in class. Nobody ever spotted the special gift that is, his remarkable intellect. No one ever encouraged him. I always think about that because I think in some ways that's who you and I are in the eyes of God. Maybe we can look at two different kinds of people. There are people who are prodigies. He was a prodigy. That guy who knew so much philosophy, he was a prodigy. When we look at the Bible, you know, like the 4-year-old girl can play Chopin. When we look at the Bible, we'll look at two of the great characters in the New Testament, Peter and Paul. Paul was a prodigy. If you've ever read the letters of Paul, you know that this man was brilliant. He was an intellectual giant. He was a theological genius. 2,000 years later, we read Paul and we're still stunned. I don't know about you. I'm still stunned by how brilliant this man was. Some of his work in Romans, as an example, theologians are still trying to figure out exactly what it was he meant. So he was a prodigy. On the other hand, we take someone like Peter, who was always out over his skis, who was always trying too hard. The truth is, as an intellect, Peter was a very ordinary human being. He wasn't an extraordinarily gifted person in the eyes of God, but he was an ordinary human being who had great passion. And Jesus spotted that. He said, "Peter, you come and follow me." So we have the prodigy, the genius, and we have the ordinary person. And God, Jesus, had a place for both of them. For both of them. You cannot read the New Testament without coming to the conclusion that Jesus understood this powerful fact that God has planted inside of each and every one of us, no matter who we are, what we do, a special gift. And there's a way in which to use that gift for growing the kingdom of God. This also means that it changes the way in which we look at God. If it changes the way in which we look at ourselves, it surely changes the way in which we look at God. I don't know about you, but I think most people grow up believing that God is looking at us, trying to catch us doing something wrong, right? That there's a great big judgmental God, and primarily God's job is to kind of look after everybody and see who's being naughty and who's being nice. When I graduated from seminary, my first job was at First Methodist Church, downtown Dallas. And it's a great preacher. I worked for a great preacher, Robert E. Goodrich Jr. He was later elected a bishop. And Dr. Goodrich was such a powerful preacher. And I remember one day he told a story. I've shared this. Some of you may remember me telling this story before. But he told a story about growing up as a child. He grew up in a pastor's home, as did I. And I don't remember where they were living, but his mother and father, his father was a pastor, and they had a member of the church that came over one afternoon and brought them a gift. And they were so proud of this gift. It was a great big picture, a framed picture that they called the Eye of God. It was a small town. Everybody knew everybody. And he said this picture was just awful. It was a picture of a great big eyeball like this. And in the center of the eyeball, in the very center of the eyeball, was a picture of the globe, the earth. And the eyeball was kind of looking in like this. And the point was that God can see everything throughout the earth all the time, that this big eyeball, the eye of God. He said his parents didn't have any choice because these were members of the church. And so they hung that picture in the living room above the divan, above the couch. He said, I hated that picture. He said, that was the scariest picture in the world. He said, I would walk to the living room, and he said, the way this thing worked, you could feel it following. It's like the eye would. He said, I walked to the living room, and it would just be following me. So especially at night, it just felt really, really spooky. He said, one time, I went out to the country to visit my cousins who lived on the farm. And they had an idea. Somebody found some of those old cigarettes where you roll your own, and some tobacco, roll your own cigarettes. This is what kids used to do in the country. He said, we all went behind the barn, and we had those cigarettes. We were rolling cigarettes. He said, we just lit them up and started smoking them. And I looked up, and right there at the edge of the barn, I saw the eye of God coming around, catching me. So I hated the eye of God. But that's the way we grew up a lot, isn't it? That somehow God is looking at us, trying to catch us doing something wrong. Mark tells us that Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee, finding these ordinary, not very religious fishermen, and trying to catch them doing something right, telling them, there's a place for you in the kingdom of God. What difference would that make in your life or in mine if we understood that God is always looking for that on the inside of us, which is good and needed in the kingdom of God? I want to finish by telling you about a program in this church that hardly anybody knows about. It's called SOS School on Sundays. Missy Wilkinson started this. I see her back there. In addition to Project Hope, in addition to Project Next Generation, in addition to these mentoring programs that we have in two elementary schools near us, Missy said that's not enough. We need to start having school on Sunday for children, many of whom come from a background where there is a disadvantage, a poverty of what we call a poverty of hope around here. They haven't had as good a start as everybody else. The truth is anybody can go to school on Sunday. It'll start here in a few minutes at noon. Is it happening today, Missy? Is it today? No, we're off tomorrow, right? So it's not going to be there today. But whenever there's school on Monday, we have school on Sunday here at noon. And these families come in and people serve lunch. A lot of these children are hungry. Guess what? Their families join them. A lot of their parents and siblings are hungry as well. And they spend 30 minutes eating. And then Missy says, time to get started. And there are remarkable stories of these children who are being tutored. And guess what? You don't have to be a genius in calculus in order to help a fifth grader with his math homework. And we got children who started off behind and now they're excelling. We've got families who come hungry and now they're fed. We have elementary schools who say, what happened? Why is this child suddenly performing so well? I don't know. It may be we have some really gifted people, some prodigies up there that are tutoring these children and serving them lunch. For the most part, I just think we have Peters and Andrews and James and Johns up there. People who somehow know that God has seen what is best in them. A desire to serve and a heart that cares about children and their families who haven't had a good start. And the kingdom of God is slowly growing at school on Sundays. Jesus came along and He found these ordinary human beings. And he said, God has a job for you. We need you in the kingdom of God. I think that's what Jesus thinks about every single person in this room. What do you think?